Here at Prophecy in the News, we spend a lot of time preparing to bring you the very best television production that we possibly can. And recently we've been doing programs on the Torah designs and the alphabetic designs of certain books of the Bible. And we've had a few phone calls from folks who said, it's boring already. Would you get on to something a little more interesting? And you know, we had a program back in July on water that was discovered on the Temple Mount, and someone has written us and said, oh, let's not be so sensational. So we have a hard time going from boring to sensational here at Prophecy in the News. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the water really is on the Temple Mount.
JR, this has been a controversy ever since that July program. And I have here a typical letter from a lady who writes, I felt compelled to write you concerning your latest program over the Temple Mount. You had spoken about water flowing, or starting to flow anyway. I have a contact in Israel, so I mailed them about what you said. I thought it would be prudent for you to know the reply. I appreciate your studying the Bible and Hebrew. Please don't get into sensationalism. In love, because of Jesus. And then she signs her name. And by the way, she sent along the letter from her friends in Israel. Now she had instructed them, and she said, JR and Gary said, there's water on the Temple Mount, and I want you to go up there and see if you can see it.
Right.
And her friends did.
Yes. So they went inside, they took their shoes off and went inside the Mosque of Omar and walked around in their stocking feet and their sock feet and went down the steps into the cellar underneath the rock. And sure enough, the floor was dry, it was not moist in any form whatsoever, and they concluded, aha, it's not true.
That's right.
However, while they were there, they did visit over in a few other places. And Gary, tell us what they found.
Now, here's the actual letter that was sent from Jerusalem. These friends were commissioned to go find the water. And I quote, our first stop was the top of the Temple Mount. There was no water flowing. We moved on to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There was no water there either. Next, we went to the Dome of the Rock, where we actually went in and under the rock. And that's where you described they walked around in their stocking feet. We did not notice any water, they write. Then we went out to the inside of the eastern gate. Here we did see some water. There were two hoses and we could hear a pump. There was just a small trickle of water coming out from the two hoses. We decided to leave the top of the mountain and go down to the wall on the western side. There we did see a trickle of water dripping into the tunnel on the men's side of the prayer area. Someone had placed a cup under the dripping and they were collecting water to be given away as holy water. Well, that's about all the water there is to report about on the Temple Mount. And they sent this to their friend and said, there's no water up there.
Okay.
Okay.
No water on the Temple Mount? Just a couple of hoses and a pump in the eastern gate.
Right.
And just a cup collecting water seeping out of the western wall. Now, you've got to understand that that's a pretty wide area there.
Yes.
One drops off on the east side, the other drops off on the west side of the mountain. And there's water both on the east side and the west side. And it's just a trickle. Well, I thought about the newspaper that we used to put out, and this is back in November of 1987, and we wrote an article at that time entitled Water Found on Mount Moriah. And here's what we wrote. Gary wrote this. A spring of water has been discovered under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, fulfilling a prophecy found in Psalm 87. Gary, let's look at Psalm 87 for a moment, since that was 1987, and see what the Scripture has to say there.
Okay, let me turn.
Our take on it is that there was a fulfillment of prophecy here in Psalm 87.
Well, Psalm 87 is a psalm that specifically refers to Mount Zion. His foundation is in the holy mountains. The Lord loveth the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Now that tells you what we're talking about. And as you go down through this psalm, you come to the 7th verse. I won't read the whole thing, and it says, as well the singers as the players on the instruments shall be there. All my springs are in thee.
Aha.
Springs.
So the spring of water in thee, and his foundation is in the holy mount. So that spring of water is in the foundation of the holy mount. Is that what it says?
It's in Psalm 87. That's what it says.
So here we are, November of 1987, and we say we pass along with interest an item recently published in a Levitt letter from Zola Levitt Ministries. Mr. Levitt has a friend in Jerusalem, an Orthodox Jew, who tells of a possible new geological development beneath the western wall and the Dome of the Rock. So we went to our files and we got the Levitt letter here, and the big article headline is Living Water. And Zola Levitt is possibly the first minister to actually publish this news report that there was water under Mount Moriah. He writes, and I quote, "I promised in our last letter that I would reveal a new prophecy development." He calls it a new prophecy development.
Yes, indeed.
"That I learned during our Pentecost tour in June. I don't know how to evaluate what I'm going to report, so I'll just tell you the facts and you can be the judge." And then it goes on to say, "A friend of mine, an Orthodox Jew in Jerusalem, whom I trust, informed me of a peculiar situation taking place in the depths of Mount Moriah below the sites of the Western Wall and the Dome of the Rock. Since archaeologists dug out the area a few years ago, both Jews and Muslims have an interest in being as close as possible to their respective sacred shrines. Those who have been in Jerusalem realize that the wall and the dome lie in very close proximity at the northern end of the exposed Western Wall." He writes, "The rabbis started a yeshiva some time ago in order to train the future priesthood in the rituals of sacrifice. The yeshiva was very disturbed recently to discover moisture on their books and scrolls, and they went to the police. They declared that apparently the Muslims, who have similar encampments just to the east beneath the dome, have surreptitiously brought water into the subterranean enclosure and were trying to damage the study materials of their adversaries. At the same time, the Muslims also came to the police complaining that they found moisture in their own enclave, and they accused the Jews of piping in water to weaken the foundation of the huge Dome of the Rock temple overhead. Both sides had apparently a good case, since there is no source of water in Mount Moriah, and there never was." How about that, Gary?
Yeah, and Zola goes on, and by the way, this is a 1987 Levitt letter, volume 9, number 7, and he goes on then to detail the history of the Temple Mount, pointing out that there never had been water up on the mount, that it had to be brought up there. They had to arrange for incredible amounts of water for construction crews, even during the days of Herod and going all the way back to Solomon. There's never been a source of flowing or living water.
Yeah. And being as smart as they were in the days of Solomon and in the days of Herod, if there had been any water on that mountain, they would have found it. So writes Zola Levitt. And then he mentions the fact that in Zechariah 14, the Mount of Olives will cleave in two, it is coming, and it shall be in that day, verse 8 says, that living waters shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, the Dead Sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea, the Mediterranean. In summer and winter shall it be. And he concludes, could it be that God is making ready a new and powerful spring of water to come out of Mount Moriah? He says, look up, for your redemption draweth nigh.
Wow.
So writes Zola Levitt 12 years ago, in 1987, November 1987.
Now, JR, what's fascinating about this to me is that the water on the Temple Mount has been increasing in volume in those 12 years. And in fact, the reason we did our program in early July is in response to a May 28, 1999 letter from the Temple Mount faithful, Gershon Solomon. And Gershon Solomon says, one of the most exciting events over the last few days has been the news of water flowing from the holy rock of Abraham and Isaac on the Temple Mount, which was in the midst of the first and second temples. According to what we know, the water is definitely flowing from under the rock. The Arabs on the Temple Mount deny this and have tried to stop the flow by many means, but have not succeeded. What we now know is that they are trying to bring in special pumps to stop the flow. In any case, the water continues to flow. Nothing can stop it. JR, we've had independent corroboration of the special pumps. The two ladies who went up there to check saw hoses and heard pumps.
But don't be sensational. We wouldn't want to be sensational. When we come back, we're going to talk about Ezekiel and just how much water there will be. Don't go away. We'll be back right around the corner. On today's Prophecy in the News, we've been talking about water discovered under the Temple Mount, emerging from the bedrock of the mountain, the foundation of the Lord. Psalm 87 says, "My springs are in thee." And it was in 1987 that Zola Levitt first introduced the water coming out from under the mountain in a place where no water had ever been before. In the days of Solomon's temple or in the days of Herod's temple, there was no water there. They had to build cisterns under that mountain to collect rainwater and also to carry water up from the Gihon Spring, which is down at the south side of the mountain.
That's right. And I wanted to, just to reiterate that we're not talking here about heroic amounts of water. When we say that water is now flowing from the Temple Mount, we're not talking about seeing a river or an artesian well or a geyser. We're just talking about a continually enlarging seepage that seems to be coming up from inside Mount Moriah. I'm holding here Israel Wire, Jewish publication, June 11th, 1999, Water from the Rock on the Temple Mount. And this is from Or Somayach in Israel, a religious institution. And it seems to be their thrust in this particular publication to downplay. They do not deny that there is water, which they call a mysterious trickle of water from under the dome of the rock. But they say this, and I'm quoting, "Even if true, this may or may not be significant." In other words, at this point in time, Or Somayach in Israel does not want to attach great prophetic significance to this flow because lest people run off in all directions and say the Messiah is coming and so forth and so on. I think that they're trying to put a lid on it, if you will.
Yes. But Zola Levitt, 12 years ago, put a prophetic slant on this water when he said, "I promised in our past letter that I would reveal a new prophecy development."
Yeah.
That's what it says, black and white right here. And then he goes on to quote Zechariah 14:4, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. There will be a very great valley." And verse 8 says, "It shall be in that day that living water shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, the Dead Sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea." He writes the Mediterranean. "In summer and winter shall it be." Water flowing from both sides of the mountain, on the west side and on the east side. And how much water will there be? Are we talking about a Niagara Falls here? No, of course not. If there were that much water, it would flood everything. There would be no millennial temple there if there were a flood. But let's go to Ezekiel and find out. Well, you have a scripture there in Joel.
In Joel. I wanted, before we go to
talk about that water.
Go to Joel before we go to Ezekiel. Joel 3:18, speaking of the kingdom era, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the mountains shall drop down new wine, the hills shall flow with milk, and all the rivers of Judah shall flow with waters, and a fountain shall come forth of the house of the Lord, and shall water the valley of Shittim." Or the valley of the brooks, or the valley of the acacia trees. It's variously translated, but we're talking about water coming out and flowing down into the valley, probably on the eastern side there.
Now, let's look at Ezekiel 47. Ezekiel says, "Afterward he brought me again to the door of the house, and behold, waters issued out from under the threshold of the house eastward." Well, now, if water is coming out from under a threshold of a house, it can't be a whole lot of water. It would corrupt the foundation of the house, and the house would fall.
And furthermore, when we talk about the threshold of the house, we're talking about the temple. And the threshold may not actually be the door of the temple itself, but rather a gate that's out some distance from the temples, which is called the threshold.
And then he writes in verse 2, he brought me out of the way of the gate northward. So they left the temple area, i.e. Muslim Mosque of Omar area, and walked northward, and led me about the way without unto the utter gate by the way that looketh eastward. So if you were to walk northward out of the temple gate and come down the steps and go northward a little ways and turn to your right, lo and behold, you're there at the eastern gate. And the eastern gate is slightly to the north, on the northern side of the temple compound area. It's not directly east of the temple.
Now, J.R., if I'm not mistaken, you have actually stood in that area.
Yes, I have been there.
And it's dry. That is, when you were there, you didn't see hoses or pumps or water or anything.
I did not.
And yet these two ladies who were up there just a few weeks ago said we went out to the inside side of the eastern gate where J.R. has stood himself. And they said there were two hoses and we could hear a pump. There was just a small trickle of water coming from the two hoses. This is exactly what Ezekiel's describing, right?
Yes. I visited there about 12 years ago, okay, back in 1987. And I didn't see any water there at the time, but since then, the water has become a nuisance.
That's true.
So that they put a couple of hoses and pumps down there to pump the water out to try to stop the flow. Goes on to say in verse 3, and when the man that had the line in his hand went forth eastward, he measured 1,000 cubits. That's about a third of a mile at 20.67 inches per cubit. That would take us down to what I surmise to be about the bottom of the mountain at the brook Kedron, the Kedron Brook, which, by the way, is dry today.
Yes.
But in that day, it says, he brought me through the waters, and the waters were to the ankles. So here we've come all the way off the mountain down into the valley, a third of a mile, 1,000 cubits, and the water is ankle deep. Now he goes down that brook about another third of a mile, another 1,000 cubits, and the waters then were to the knees. Say, folks, that's not a Niagara Falls. And we're not trying to sensationalize something here. We're reporting something that we feel is found in the prophecies of the Bible to this very day. And in this last decade has been developing. It's under development, it's growing. We don't know how far it's going to be, but I think it is definitely significant.
J.R., it says that in Ezekiel that one day this is going to water the desert. Now, this is certainly not happening today. In other words, we're seeing perhaps just the tiny precursor of the living water. Certainly, if rabbis at the Western Wall, J.R., are collecting cups of this and then using it for holy or sanctified purposes, they must think of it as living water.
Well, that just happened to be the headline of the Levitt letter 12 years ago. He called his headline, Living Water. I suppose Zola Levitt was probably the first minister to announce this new discovery in America.
I believe we should give him credit, and by the way, we appreciate his note because it really started us. It directed our attention. We quoted him, we wrote an article, and we've been watching ever since. And by the way, so is Gershon Solomon of the Temple Mount Faithful. He's the man who wants to put a cornerstone up there and build a temple. And if anybody's watching the Temple Mount, it's Gershon Solomon.
Well, you know, you've got to have good footing and foundation in order to build something like a temple up there. You can't have it being eroded by water.
Right.
And so if they do build, they'll have to build it around the water, won't they?
Indeed they will.
And another fascinating thing about this is that God says in Psalm 87, my springs are in the plural. Well, Gary, coming out from under the south side of the Temple Mount is the Gihon Spring.
That's true.
And now coming out of both the west side and the east side of the top area of the Temple Mount are a spring of water. It's free-flowing. However small it might be, it's free-flowing. There's a possibility that another spring will open up near the foot of the mountain on the eastern side, because by the time he gets out a mile away from the Temple Mount, it's waters to swim in. That's a lot of water.
Lot of water. And where currently now there are simply what they call wadis. Out in West Texas, they call those dry riverbeds. Gulches.
Yes.
So anyway, JR, I still think we have here a legitimate story. Again, we are reporting something that we feel is a legitimate story, a legitimate phenomenon that, that leads us to look toward the prophecies of the Bible. We are not looking at fulfilled prophecy, JR.
No.
This hasn't been fulfilled yet in Ezekiel. It's
Not completely.
Not completely.
This chapter 47 of Ezekiel is after the Battle of Armageddon. After the Lord comes back. He shows up in chapter 43.
Right.
See? And chapter 38 is the Battle of Gog and Magog. Chapter 39 moves the Battle of Gog and Magog right on through Armageddon. I think the tribulation period starts with the Battle of Gog and Magog and ends with Armageddon, and we have it all in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And then we see the Temple Mount being refurbished, rebuilt, and so on. And so that's when the final fulfillment will be.
Absolutely. So whether we're doing word studies or whether we're reporting on phenomena from Israel, we're reporting, nevertheless.
Yes, and we want to be accurate for our people. We'll be back in just a moment.